Okay, so I'm going to talk today about digital text and what digital text does to our conceptions of time. When I started thinking about this paper, I was initially quite stumped because I thought, heavens, what does a digital humanities scholar, which is what I am, know about time? We don't really think about that very much in digital humanities. But luckily, actually, I'm also these days also an English scholar, and was in my in the old days, as it were. And into my head, in this moment of perplexity, came the T.S. Eliot's poem, "The Dry Salvages," which is part of the four quartets. And in this poem, Eliot is obsessed with time in all of the four quartets. He keeps thinking about time. So I just wanted to start with this because this was my jumping off point, if you like, for this talk. So when there is distress of nations and perplexity, whether on the shores of Asia or in the Edgware Road, men's curiosity searches past and future and clings to that dimension. But to apprehend the point of intersection of the timeless with time is an occupation for the saint. No occupation either, but something given and taken in a lifetime's death in love, ardor and selflessness and self-surrender. For most of us, there is only the unattended moment, the moment in and out of time. So this is just this question about the intersection of the timeless with time. Just made me think about that's how, in a sense, this is what digital text is doing. Now, this is, you might start to think, well, what is so particular about this poem? Well, Eliot was writing this during the Second World War. He wrote the poem in 1940. He wrote the poem in 1940 while suffering the bombardment of London. And so when he talks about times of distress of nations and perplexity, you know, he means that in a very particular sense. But he's kind of universalizing that experience of, you know, he is thinking about the question of time because of warfare, and that does tend to concentrate people's minds. But in 1941, the four quartets are published, and at the same time, curiously enough, again, we have a question about synchronicity. At the same time, in the other side of the Atlantic, at MIT's radiation lab was being set up. And it was, you can see this is a picture of what was known as the RAD lab at MIT. And this was set up in collaboration with British scientists who made what was at that time a very dangerous journey across the Atlantic, because they'd invented something that's actually a microwave magnetometer that actually ends up being in pretty much all of our kitchens because it's the basis of the microwave oven. But it turned out to be really, really important in terms of radar systems for air defense. And so the particularly visionary scientist and scientific politician saw the point of this, and even before America went into the war, realized that American production capacity was going to be necessary to make these magnetometers. And here he is, this guy here, and he's called Vannevar Bush. Now, for those of you who are interested in ideas about hypertext, Vannevar Bush is better known as somebody who pretty much invented the idea of hypertext. But he was also, and what we forget is he was also a incredibly powerful scientific politician and someone who'd worked a lot on analog computing, and here he is with one of the analog computers. And so you've got this kind of weird concatenation, this weird synchronicity of Eliot thinking about time, and at the same time, back where Eliot came from in New England, people are working on this question of how do we develop this new radar system. So, okay, why is this relevant to digital text? Because, let me just go on to this next one. As I say, Vannevar Bush was the inventor of this idea of something which he called the Memex, which would have been an information system which allowed people to make associative links rather than linear arguments, or the kind of information systems at the time were very dominated by the kind of classification principles of librarianship, such as MARC records and the Dewey system, etc. But Vannevar Bush realized that the amount of information in circulation was getting larger and larger, and these systems were just not sufficient to allow us to get information out of them. And he was actually thinking about this during the Second World War itself, and he actually had the original draft of As We May Think, which is this article where he proposes this. He actually originally wanted to have it published in 1939, but nobody was especially interested at the time. But the experience of the Second World War, the huge amounts of scientific research going on at huge speed with so many people, thousands and thousands of people, you think this rad lab, it's like 12 guys in a hut. It's not. It were about 3,000 engineers working in it at some point. So you had to think about, how do we connect ideas? And so, I mean, this is a lovely kind of, I think, late 80s or early 90s bit of graphic from, I should think, a Mac hypertext system explaining what hypertext is. But basically the idea being that you link digital text by means of, as I say, associative ideas, not a kind of first there's this, then there's that, then there's the other, beginning, middle and end type of argument. Now, okay, we're very, very used to that now, because the internet runs on this, the web runs on this. But that was a really new idea at the time, and its foundations really do lie in the work of the Rad Lab and those engineers from the UK who went over to work with the American colleagues. And that links in with Vannevar Bush's thinking about, how do we develop this new system? Things were moving so fast in terms of scientific ideas. And one of the reasons he thought this was terribly important and wanted to publish this in 1946 was to try to stop the proliferation of nuclear technology. Obviously he'd been the head of the Manhattan Project, which was to make America's first nuclear bomb, but realized that unless information was shared not only between the UK and the US, but also what were to become the Iron Curtain countries with Russia, then there was likely to be an extremely damaging nuclear arms race. Of course, he was right. But he was trying to think about, how would we share information most effectively? So now, hypertext is not the same as digital text. Digital texts don't have to be organized in hypertext, but they often are. And the internet is probably the hypertext that most of us are familiar with. But I want to think for the rest of this presentation, therefore, about how digital text and also hypertext kind of deform our ideas of temporality. Because I think hypertext is one of those massive disruptor of temporality, but not the only one. So if we look at textual deformation, this is a quite old now, but it's a very effective visualization package for digital text, often used in the arts and humanities, called Voyant, whose creator, Stephen Sinclair, sadly died extremely young last year. So this is a great tribute to Stefan, but this is, in a sense, quite typical of many text analysis packages. And what you can see here is, this is the text of Love's Labours Lost visualized. This is a play. You would not necessarily know that from this. This could be any text at all. This could be any bit of text written by anybody. And it completely, the fact that we're looking at it in a text analysis package, with putting digital text in, and out come all of these sorts of visualizations, which give us an idea of things like word frequencies, which words tend to appear in collocation with others. So what's the structure of the language that tends to sit around the word shall? Okay, that's all really interesting, but it completely plays with our idea of temporality, or indeed it gets rid of it, because there is absolutely no sense that we've got of this being a play. Dramatic irony is a terribly important device in drama. Obviously, that idea that we know something is going to happen, but the character who's undergoing that doesn't. You know, their time is different from our time as a spectator. You can't do dramatic irony if you rip your text up into basically word length elements as you're doing here. So the whole idea of doing digital analysis of text, or computational analysis of text, does change that idea of temporality very fundamentally. Just to zoom in here on one of those bits of display. I mean, this is what's known as keyword in context, which is very commonly used in in what used to be called humanities computing. It was one of the kind of early things that people used, looking at the context of words, looking at the kind of linguistic interpretation automatically of language. But you can see by this how much, you know, there's nothing, this makes no sense, because all you're looking at is the context of the words. You have no idea what the grammatical constructions around that is, and you have no idea of what narrative it might be. We don't know where in the play these are. They're not necessarily in the order of occurrence. They're probably something to do with it. They may well be in the order of frequency. So I was thinking about how that deforms our idea of narrative. Now, digital text may also, we've been talking about acceleration a bit, and digital text does accelerate things in that sense that, you know, you can get hold of a lot more text a lot more quickly. And indeed, you know, having looked at those keyword in context displays, you can analyze it a lot more quickly than just reading through it and noting things down, which is, you know, your classic way of doing literary scholarship. And this is a screenshot from the Blake archive, you can see here. And you know, it means you can quickly search for your text. You can go to the right place. If in this case we're looking for The Lamb by William Blake, famous songs of innocence, which is parallel to the tiger in Songs of Experience. Now, and that's very, very efficient, but this is a very different idea of reading as compared to a book, which you might leaf through, which you might take a bit longer to come to, which you might actually want to read some of the other poems either side of it. You know, poetry often has a sort of internal narrative to it. But equally with Blake, I mean, this is even more interesting. Whoa, sorry about that. This is even more interesting in some ways, that Blake wanted you to be able to read his poems in a very different kind of context. I'm just going to move the display over a bit here for me. You can see that this is all Blake's own work. You know, he wanted people to be seeing the images and the text together, which, you know, for the time, that was really quite, you know, quite radical technology of its own time for the early 19th century. But he wanted, you know, all of the poems are like this. This is not unusual. Yet when you encounter this image in the Blake archive, it's completely divorced from the text. You know, there is no image content around it. So it has really changed the way Blake thought that people would be reading his text. And as I say, this is not accidental. Blake cared very, very deeply about what we might say call the multimedia context of his text, so that this is actually it's a really important loss. You know, what you lose, what you gain in the speed and convenience, you massively lose in terms of having a sense of, I mean, aesthetic beauty, quite apart from anything else, but also that sense of how Blake wanted to control the reception of his text. The one for the tiger I haven't included, but you should definitely go and look at it. It's got a very cute tiger. I'm sure he'd probably never seen a tiger. It doesn't look all that scary. So let's carry on to the next slide now. Now, just thinking about different sorts of narrative that digital text might give us. This is a timeline of various people talking about a particular game, which was the Leeds versus Manchester United game the other week. I am a Leeds fan. And in a sense, we see, you know, this is called a timeline on Twitter. And in a sense, it's a very different form of narrative. It's highly, highly disrupted. You know, in a sense, these are sort of characters in a drama, just like the characters are in Love Saber's Lost that we saw earlier on. But they're very highly fragmented. You know, you see this as a kind of conversation, but you know, many people on social media will follow literally thousands of people, and there's no way you literally cannot keep a sense of narrative going when you've got that many people in your timeline. So there is a sense that you could say it's like a narrative, it's like a drama. You're seeing sort of little mini dramas develop. There's a kind of mini narrative here, but it's a very, very disrupted drama, if you like. So just to finish with, thinking about some of the implications of this for some of the work we've done previously. Now you can see that this timeline looks really quite like a Twitter timeline, and this is actually from an application that we developed way back in, oh gosh, it must have been about 2010, 2011, to allow people to use digital interaction to think about exhibits in the Petrie Museum of Zoology in London, which is part of UCL. And the idea being that we used static iPad 1s, which were amazing. That was really new technology in those days. And instead of having a label in the museum, well, we did have label museums in the museum labels, but we also thought about asking people questions about what they thought about the exhibits, which they could then they respond to in the form of a timeline. So again, you get a different sort of narrative, because the museum label is in itself a little narrative. Let's face it, it's just a very, very little narrative because it's about 60 words. But this was about having people think about questions and talk to each other about, you know, what they thought, which was actually very interesting. But it didn't actually go anywhere. It won several prizes, and it was predicted to be, you know, the wave of the future and how museums would be in future, and everybody would be doing this, and yet they're not. It didn't really. There are all sorts of things that I could speculate on about why it didn't really become as popular as people thought it would, but I think it's something to do with the fact that actually people visiting the museums like an idea of being told stories on the labels. They like an idea that an exhibition flows. You know, and museum professionals like the idea of creating a narrative through their curation of particularly a particular exhibit. Now, if you have these asking questions and getting visitors to talk to each other instead of attending to the stories, you disrupt that narrative flow. And again, so this is what digital text does. Now, just to finish, as I say, we tried all these things. Oh, you know, we thought the disruptive power. We weren't specifically trying to disrupt, but we were trying to engage people differently. And yet people really love that idea of narrative. And what we're seeing here is that despite, you know, we go back to hypertext, we think of how disruptive it could be, that instead of having a linear narrative, people could, you know, choose their own paths through hypertext, rather like, you know, choose your own adventure books. They could pick where they wanted to go. They wouldn't be controlled by the authorial voice. People were very excited about that. Particularly in the 1990s when the web was new and you could begin to put things like the Blake Archive up on the web. And yet, what do we see during the pandemic? But that people are buying more and more and more books. And almost all of those are in print, but also even if they're not, even if they're ebooks, they're pretty much the exact same thing as a book that is printed. They're linear narratives. They tell stories, and I think this speaks to the kind of pervasive power of narrative, and that, you know, why stories are part of who we are as humans. As humans, we are, you know, Aristotle talks about, you know, humans are animals that live in cities. But actually, I think humans are animals who tell stories and who plan things and who crave narrative because it helps us make sense of our world. So that's just some of my ideas. And I want to finish with another quote from Eliot, because it's always difficult, you know, these are just ideas, and he picks this up himself in that, you know, the whole nature of writing and the whole nature of thinking is so contingent, and we can never be sure what we're really concluding. So I will conclude with Eliot's words again. These are only hints and guesses, hints followed by guesses. and the rest is prayer, observance, discipline, thought, and action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Claire.